Good evening, I'm Dr. Phil Hoffman and welcome to 180 Days Rewind. We hope you enjoyed watching the presentation from PBS of 180 Days Hartsville, and now we're going to take a look at what that means here in Missouri as we talk to several folks who are involved in public education right here in your hometown. Stay tuned, that's coming up next. And we're happy to be here tonight with some folks from the various school systems within the KMOS viewing area. And I'd like to introduce those folks to you now. First up is Dr. Andrew Stiepleman, Peter Stiepleman rather, and Dr. Stiepleman is the superintendent of the Columbia Public School System. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for the invitation.
And also we have Dr. Scott Patrick. Dr. Patrick is the superintendent of Warrensburg City Schools. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And finally, joining us is Dr. Joyce Ryerson, who is the superintendent from Versailles Schools.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for joining us. Well, I guess the first place to start maybe is now that we've watched the 180 Days program, let's talk a little bit about just some of the parallels, some of the things that you saw in there that you see also in your school system. So Dr. Stiepleman, if you want to start with that.
So, you know, when I watched this movie, we watched it a week ago. Also, we brought our Columbia teachers and some of our community and student teachers from the University of Missouri to come and watch the movie with us to sort of talk about what are the parallels that we see between what's going on in Hartsville and what is happening in Columbia. And I imagine my colleagues share some similar stories, which is that you have these stories of resilience or stories of poverty, the challenges with high stakes testing, and just looking at some of those barriers for both kids and certainly for teachers. And then you look at administrators who are sort of caught in the middle of it all, because principals have this really strange position where they get a lot of pressure from us, from superintendents, right. But of course from their parents as well, and from their teachers. And so it is a fascinating tale, and although I wish I could say I'm surprised by anything that happened, because I think that so many of the things that we saw are happening in our own districts.
It's really interesting. It doesn't matter whether you're a very small school or a large school. These things happen everywhere. We all deal with them. We all have to deal with them in a little bit different way, but it's very, very common. So there are a lot of ties that we see to this program on a regular basis, and that's just part of dealing with students and dealing with kids these days.
I'd kind of agree in having conversations with some of my colleagues. You know, I'm a fairly small school district, and when you look in the urban areas and even a bigger school like Hartsville was, compared to myself, a lot of the common themes that are there is that generational poverty and the things that you deal with in trying to make sure that kids have what they need, the basics, just to be able to come to school. Some of those things certainly resonate with me as we struggle to provide those for our students in our district.
You know, Phil, if I may,
sure.
You mentioned to me earlier that 75% of your audience, of your viewing audience, resides in Columbia. And one of the things that I don't know if Columbia always understands is that in the year 2000, only 26% of the students were on free or reduced lunch. And now it's almost 50%. And so when you look at that rise in poverty, what comes with that, just like she said, you know, these basic needs are not always met. And I know that we both are challenged with homelessness. We're challenged with students who just come from these fragile homes, or as you said, they're coming from this generational poverty. And how can we as schools play a role in breaking that cycle?
Well, and that's one of the things at the end, Mrs. Mann, when she's answering the question, you know, what's the biggest challenge your kids face? She puts it a little more politely. She says money as opposed to poverty. But I think we had several conversations out in Columbia and Warrensburg and in Jefferson City. And one of the things, Scott, for me that really stood out in our conversation was just talking about, you know, sort of the homeless population in Warrensburg schools. Yes. Yeah, I think for me that was kind of eye-opening a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can, and I think it's really shocking and eye-opening to a lot of people. You don't think of a town and a community like Warrensburg of having a very high homeless population, but we about 7 out of the last 8 years we've received a statewide homeless grant, and there's only about 8 districts in the state that receive those grants. So to have that to receive that grant, you have to have a high number of homeless students in your district, and every year it's somewhere over 250 students in our district of 3,200 students that are classified as homeless. And that,
to put that into some context, so we have about 18,000 in Columbia students, and only about, at least as far as we know, about almost close to 200 homeless students. And so just that ratio is just is so significant.
Right.
And so the question is why and how. You know, you wouldn't think we are still pretty rural, but close enough to the Kansas City area and to bigger schools, and you wouldn't think that there would be a homelessness issue, but there is. So the good part about having the homeless grant and the good part about the state having programs like that is that it does allow our school district to provide resources for those students and their families, so that they don't have to worry about some of those basic needs, school supplies, clothing, food on the weekends, back snack programs, those kinds of things. So for those kids to be prepared and well prepared enough to come to our schools ready to learn, we got to get past all those issues of being homeless and not having a what we call a regular fixed home environment.
Mm-hmm. And we have to look at our own expectations for those kids. Right, so if you've got a kid who is coming from such a fragile home, we have to really challenge our own expectations to not, they'll meet our low expectations if we set them low. Sure. And so we have to really be thinking about, this kid is capable, this kid can, just because his circumstances don't dictate his future, right? And I think they say something like that in the documentary, that your circumstances don't dictate who you are and what you can become. Smart is not what you are, it's what you become, right? That whole mindset work that many of us are investing in and invested in. So.
Well, in your case, Joyce, I know you're maybe, of the three schools that are represented here, more rural than the other two. This is not, the poverty problem, the issue of money is not exclusive to urban city school systems.
No, it's not. I mean, I first came to my district in 2000, and at that time we were a little over 50% on free or reduced lunch. Right now we're about 67%. One of my elementaries is 80%, the other one's at 75%. So, I mean, we have a lot of kids who come from that generational poverty background. It's what we struggle with, and while we don't have the grants like Warrensburg's receiving, we're very fortunate that we have a very active community. We have a Morgan County Caring for Kids Coalition that provides back-to-school supplies. They provide gifts at Christmas. This year they provided shoes. We had a grant that was given to one of the churches locally. They provided shoes for every elementary and every middle school child this year. We have dental programs that for kids that don't have any insurance, that have no means of going to the dentist, their parents can take advantage of the free clinic that comes to the school. So, it's meeting some of those basic needs so that you can go beyond to help them reach the potential and what they're able to do.
One question I think I have, because you know this better than I, the change in the amount of students that qualify for free and reduced lunch. Has there been a change in the standards, or is this truly a shifting of what's going on with families in our area?
The standards go up every year as far as what it takes to qualify. It seems like they ratchet up a little bit more. Number.
And when you talk about foundation formula funding, they also, you get something called a weighted ADA, your average daily attendance, but it's weighted based on free reduced lunch, the number of ELL students you have, English language learners, number of students with high needs. And each year that percentage gets ratcheted up a little bit so that you are entitled to, or you get less money even though your number goes up, their number goes up as well. And when you talked about, she mentioned money at the end.
Right.
And I heard money, and I thought absolutely generational poverty, fragile homes, all those types of things. But I also thought about a state that has underfunded its schools and how we do rely on our communities to really help us support our kids. We could do even more if we actually were fully funded. And I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I feel like it's an opportunity for us to share with the state, those viewers who are watching, certainly in Columbia, Warrensburg, and Versailles, but certainly all over the state. Our legislature has a responsibility, and the responsibility is to fully fund their schools.
And they haven't done that well for going on 10 years now, and there's hardly any schools in the state of Missouri that don't deal with that issue every year. I know everybody at this table deals with it every year. And until that funding does come through, like it should from the state, we do have to rely upon our local governments, our local school districts to fund. And here in Warrensburg, we passed the largest levy increase ever in Warrensburg last April of 88 cents. That's a big chunk of money, and our kids deserve it. Our community deserves it. But we had to do that because we haven't been receiving the adequate funding from the state of Missouri. We've lost somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million over the last 6 years that should have come to our district that the state doesn't fund us fully. So it's something we have to deal with.
In fairness, you know, the folks that are in the legislature would probably say, look, we don't have the revenues. Tax revenues are down. We can't give you more, even if we wanted to. We can't.
The answer isn't then to cut taxes on everything, right? There's so much cut, and then the response is, we really want to fund the foundation program. We want to fund your schools fully. There are ways to do that. There are ways to do that that are creative ways. Internet sales tax, a cigarette sales tax. We're the lowest of the 50 states. There are ways to make these things happen. And look, I may be now separating because I'm in Columbia, where a more progressive liberal community. But there are ways to increase revenues that are possible. It just takes some courage to do it.
So the challenge too. And one of the things that I again came out really clearly to me in our conversations around the area is when you talk about poverty, the dimensions of how that affects kids are just astounding to me. I mean, I think the thing I really came away from our conversation, Scott, when we talked, was you sort of said, well, we provide social services. That's what we do. And I think many folks look at a public school system and they say reading, writing, and arithmetic, and that's all you have to do. That's not true anymore, is it?
It's not, and I think, and I've accepted that, and I think most of my associates have accepted the fact that these kids need help, and school districts, public schools, are one of the last things that can truly help them. And we see those kids 7-8 hours a day. They are with us. We've got to be able to provide for their needs. So it is more, it's more than just academics like it used to be. We've got to make sure that they're fed. We've got to make sure that they have clothing, they have coats in the winter, school supplies at all times. I mean, it's one of those things. There are schools now that have dental clinics and medical clinics in their schools. It's just a fact, and I think it's just part of schools today being much different than they used to be.
Well, I'll go beyond the basics that we're providing with some of the cutbacks that the state has had to do in recent years, particularly to mental health. We're having social workers in many public schools because kids need services, and we're starting to see more and more students that do have those types of mental health issues.
Yeah, you mentioned something that we're particularly proud in Boone County, that the Boone County superintendents, so all 6 of us, have created a coalition. And this coalition belongs to a mental health coalition, so that all children are going to be entitled to the mental health needs. Because we know that our teachers, they tell us their #1 issue are the mental health needs of kids. Kids are really, they really struggle. And you see a child with oppositional defiance disorder or ADHD or a whole host of other mental health struggles, and we haven't necessarily always prepared them to identify and know what is going to escalate a situation, how can we de-escalate a situation, and so it's particularly exciting for us as a coalition that we're trying to figure this stuff out together, because our kids, we share them. They'll go from Ashland to Columbia right. up to Hallsville, right. And so we're now trying to figure it out together, and I think that's what we have to do. This is an opportunity. I'm going to leave here with 2 new friends, although they may not own me, but they'll disown me. But because you can't do it alone. And we tell our teachers you need to collaborate and coordinate together. Well, we need to as well.
So if you were looking at a student coming into the school system today, into your school systems, and all of you have been in education for years, what are the differences that you see in the environment and the situations for kids that we are seeing today, today's students? Because I think a lot of times when you talk to people about how schools ought to be or how things ought to be.
We get a lot of phone calls of,
Yeah.
you know, when I went to
Right,
school.
exactly.
Right,
You know, we refract through our own lens of
right.
like, you know, well, I remember, like, for example, all these problems that you guys are talking about. As a kid in school, I don't remember anybody having any of these problems. Now, maybe they did, but I don't recall it. So what are kids coming in like today? What kind of problems are they facing?
You know, I think one of the biggest issues or hurdles that we end up having to try to overcome is to try to get that family support and buy-in. The trust issue, and I don't think that's unique to necessarily my district, because I think we're seeing it throughout Missouri, throughout the nation. There's a little bit of a mistrust of what's happening at school, and it's so very important to get the support at home for what we are trying to do with the children. And if we can't get that, it makes our job all that much harder. So I think that is one thing that I have seen as a difference, say, compared to when I was in school. You know, you got in trouble at school, you were in trouble at home. You inherently trusted what was happening there. And I think that's something that we've been working to overcome.
And we do that by trying to build as many relationships as we can, not only with students but with their families. And sometimes that's not easy to do. Sometimes, possibly when you were in school, you know, your parents came to parent-teacher conferences and they were very involved in what you did. Sometimes that's not as easy as it used to be. Parents are very, very busy. It's not to say that they don't love their kids and they don't want to be involved, but there's just other things going on. So to try to keep them as involved as possible, not just in elementary school, but through secondary school, and that's always when it tapers off, is a very difficult task, and kids need that. And so it's about building those relationships with those parents and sometimes grandparents or whoever it is that's raising that child, and just do the best you can for those kids.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, and if we take it back to the documentary that we just watched, you know, she has this parent meeting, right? She's
Right.
a first-year principal, and boy, we've all been that first-year principal where you're like, I'm having this parent meeting, and then one parent shows, and we've all been there as well. You have to think about some non-traditional ways of engaging parents, because that traditional model of having a parent meeting, inviting them to the school, and expecting everyone to sit and get, it just doesn't happen anymore. So home visits. You know, that is something that I think you'll start seeing more and more of, because home visits are a very powerful way of engaging a family, where you make your first visit just about building rapport. I just want to listen. Tell me about your kid. Or at school, they do the get the scoop night, right, where you just have some ice cream and all we do is listen, right? You're your kid's best teacher. Tell us about your child. And then that second visit is really about that academic and goal setting. So
then here's my question, because you were talking earlier about distrust. Now, I know in each of your cases you've talked to me about going out and being out in the neighborhoods and talking with folks. So how is there simultaneously distrust and yet at the same time it seems to me that public educators are trying harder than ever to be accountable and to be out talking to parents?
So some of our school districts have deep roots where families have been there for some time and they do trust. Many of our districts are experiencing when you have increased poverty and you have kids with so many insecurities, I don't mean like personal, but like food insecurities, housing insecurities. They're so transient, some of our families, they're moving from school to school to school, that they don't build that kind of relationship, and those are the kinds of relationships we're trying to build. Columbia has a mobility rate of about 25%. So 1 in every 4 kids starts at one school and then ends at another. And so then we have to make sure, just like the homelessness rate here in Warrensburg, is to make sure that we're making sure the McKinney-Vento Act is being exercised, and that we're providing busing so we can get kids back and forth. Or we're investing in something called a mobility specialist. These are retired counselors who, when we notice that a kid's out, they typically don't come for another 2 weeks because they moved to a new house and they're going to get to that school. They'll get it together to get there. Well, we're making sure we send someone to the home to help facilitate that transition to that new school. Transitions are really difficult for our most fragile kids.
Mm-hmm. They are. And I would say, too, one of the biggest tools that we have in trying to help build that trust and build those relationships has been probably social media. You know, in our district, we were just discussing before we came on, you know, Twitter's not quite as big in my district, but Facebook has gotten to be huge. And, you know, I have about 1,400 kids, but I'm reaching 5,000 people a week on posts.
So
So
I have about 2,500 followers, but about 1,500 are high school students who only want to tell me to cancel school.
Right.
So I boast 2,500, but most of them are like, "Come on, Stiepleman, cancel school."
Yeah, right.
You know. So
Well, you know, and it's funny too because he'll sit like he did tonight at dinner. He'll sit and tweet out what he's doing, and I find it very
that
interesting.
sounds like I'm a little obsessive. I'm
Well-
not that obsessive about it.
But it's interesting to me because again, I think we've got good examples here in our viewing area of folks that are involved in education who are trying to meet students where they are. So if they're at Twitter, if they're on Facebook.
Yeah, but right before we were off air, we were talking about engaging our families and how do we do that. And I'm thinking these are high school students that if 60% of our students stay in Columbia, which is a stat that I've heard,
Right.
then these kids are going to be parents in about 10 years, right? And so I'm really trying to make that investment. I hope to be in Columbia for some time. And so I'm investing in getting a relationship with them so that they really do trust their schools for when they are parents in our community. So it's a little bit of an investment.
yeah, exactly.
Well, and one of the other things that came up, and maybe this gets to the trust issue we were talking about, a clear issue raised in the documentary is testing. So let's talk a little bit about the reality today in public education of testing and sort of what that has done to change the climate, to change the culture within schools.
I hope you also let us at the end talk about the wonderful
things.
things that are happening.
Absolutely.
Because I'm imagining someone sitting at home being like, oh, poverty, oh, testing.
yeah.
I mean, these are real, and I don't mean to, sorry, I'll let you.
No, you go ahead.
No, I'm
The reality is that standardized testing has been around for a long time. It will be around for a long time. We know that, but the stakes are higher now. We are in a fortunate situation here in Missouri to where we are not like some states, to where everything is so high stakes testing driven. We're not quite there yet in Missouri, and that's a good thing. And I hope we don't get there. Some states, it is, you know, it drives all their
as an
funding.
example.
Yeah.
Every teacher gets a rating, every school gets a rating,
Yeah.
and you can see, I went to Knoxville with our Chamber of Commerce, and we went to visit a school, and teacher said this was the worst thing that could have ever happened to us because, you know, they walk around going, well, I'm a B. You know, that didn't
Right.
motivate them to say, how do I become an A?
Right.
And you know, it's hard because the thing we hear most often from the teachers is, you know, I feel like I spend a lot of my time testing kids, getting ready for the test. You know, my statement to my staff at the beginning of this year, especially since the state has kind of taken a step back and they're looking at our state standards again, is that, you know, guys, we know what's good for kids. We know what a second grader needs to know when they come out in math and in English language arts and in science. And we're going to do what we know is good for kids, and that's where our focus is going to be. And if we do what we know is good for kids, the test will take care of itself. And so that was the message I left my folks with.
What you're speaking to is the fact that you've taken I think the appropriate response to testing is that testing should be about figuring out what a kid knows so that you can make great plans for that kid. It's about planning for that child's instruction, not about judging the teacher or judging the kid or judging the school. It's about saying, this is how that child did. Clearly there are some strengths and clearly there are some areas where we missed. And so how do we make sure that we are meeting that child's needs? We're personalizing that child's education. I was profoundly disappointed that, you know, I was actually kind of excited about the fact that this new assessment was going to be adaptive. Right, which meant that if a kid got something wrong, it may go down a level, and so it would truly tell us what a kid knows and doesn't know, as opposed to this child's below basic or this child's advanced. Great, what does that mean to me? But that has changed. That I guess something has happened along the way, and so my hope is that in the future that adaptive piece will come back, because I'm okay with the Smarter Balance assessment. You know, my feeling is it is truly a better, now I'm not talking about the technology involved with it and the kind of sort of trauma we may be putting kids through with having them sit at a computer and figure out how to drag and highlight and all that kind of stuff. It may be testing something very different from what we're actually trying to test. But the idea that kids should be able to read two texts, read one editorial, one piece of fact, and then compare the two, and I mean, that to me is higher level learning that we would expect our kids. I have kids in the elementary schools right now, my own children. I want them doing that.
And my hope is that we continue to focus on growth. And I think that's overlooked. And the state has made some strides on looking at progress and growth. for some kids, but it needs to be for all kids. I mean, if one of our students is very, very low to begin with, and they show a year or 2 years growth in 1 year's time period, they may not be on grade level yet, but they're showing growth. And that's a positive direction for that student. And we just need to continue to focus on showing that growth and that achievement throughout the time that they're with us in our schools.
I completely agree. Celebrate that growth.
Yeah.
And that's something we're doing with all of our staff. Every single one of them does a professional growth plan, and they identify what student growth measures they're going to look at year to year to year. And so that's been a new process, and it's very involved, and it's pretty time consuming for our principals, but I think it's a positive change that we have done.
Well, you know, I always used to tell students, I spent 14 years as a college professor before I moved here to Central Missouri, and I used to tell my students, like, you're not an A or a B, that doesn't mean anything. It's like if you're satisfied with me giving you a letter at the end of 15 weeks, then you're not doing this right. You know, there's more to it than this just final reductive way of looking at you. And to me, we've kind of done the same thing with school systems. It's a way to reduce it down to, okay, well, you're an A school system and you're a B, and that sort of thing. And it doesn't really give you the full measure of what's going on in those schools. And I think we heard that message loud and clear when we were out in the community, no question about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a question though. So you're the facilitator, but I'm going to throw one back at you.
Okay.
So when you were teaching and a kid got a B, they had opportunities to redo
Absolutely.
or figure out ways to, because it wasn't about the grade, it was about the learning, right? And I think we all, I can't speak for you guys, but I would imagine that you agree, I'm going to ascribe that you do on live television, that, you know, for us, it's about mastering a standard, mastering
Absolutely.
a skill, as opposed to just getting that grade. And so I want it to be at any point, to your point about growth, is that for us, it's not about the grade, it's about the learning.
That's that's exactly right. That's something
good,
we've been
you agree.
working on for probably 3 years now. In our district, we're working on standards-based grading, where we say this is the point that we want a kid to get to be proficient, and they have multiple chances. They can reassess if they don't do well, and you know, we're seeing kids move. It does work.
Well, and certainly anything that you learn, anything, the first time that you try things, you're probably not going to be that great at it, and it sometimes takes more steps than that. We were talking at dinner about basketball. I am terrible. I can't play basketball. No matter how much I tried, I never really got very good at it, so I recognized I had some limits there. But I think any kind of educational process that you're going through, there should be an expectation that maybe initially you won't get it 100%.
Sure. Look at the 8 mathematical standards that we look at, and one of them is perseverance, right? Is
right.
about that showing that grit. You don't know how to do it, but you're going to persevere and try to figure out how to get there. That's what I think we're learning. Well, that's what we're looking for when we're looking at student learning.
So when we look at the program that we just watched, and you guys both mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of negative in there. There's a lot of challenges that school systems face all across the country. It's true, obviously, here in Missouri as well. But the other message that I think we heard really loudly and clear when we went out in the public is there's a lot of good things happening. People just don't hear about it. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some examples of some things that in your systems you're proud of, and maybe people just don't know it if they're not directly involved.
Joyce was just saying before we went on the air that it's sometimes one of the hardest things we do is toot our own horns, and we focus on so many different things that it seems like we just don't get all the great things out there, because there are a tremendous number of great things going on in public schools in the state of Missouri. And so as superintendents, that's one of our jobs, is to communicate with our public, communicate with anybody that is willing to listen to us, and let them know that we do have strong public schools. Can we grow? Do we need to always continually improve? Absolutely. But there's great things going on. One of the things that we're most proud of here in Warrensburg, obviously, and because we have the university here, is we have a tremendously high number of students that do go on to the university or college level. It's somewhere around 75%. A lot of them go here to the university. That's easy. Some of them may have parents that are employed here. They get half-price tuition. That's a no-brainer,
Also easy.
right?
Right.
That's
Absolutely.
easier. But that's one thing that we're very proud of, and we want to always continue to have that couple that with a very low dropout rate, very high graduation rate. Those are the kinds of things that you can't say enough of.
One of the, I guess, more concrete things that I'd say that we're extremely proud of in our district, for the size of school district that we are, to be as far ahead with technology as we are. Every elementary class is E-Mints room. We have 2-to-1 grades 3 through 5. We are working on 1-to-1 technology grades 6 through 12. We have just upgraded our infrastructure, getting ready for the new assessments. To handle the bandwidth, we can do virtual field trips because of things that we can do for our kids that just wasn't possible. And a lot of our kids, they will never get to go to the Smithsonian, but we can take them there using technology. And that's been a very positive thing in our district.
Yeah, and I would say for Columbia, the mantra that we're working on, the communities with the best schools win, right? And I would imagine we all have great communities because we've got great public schools. And so Columbia is a community that is growing. We're opening up an elementary school this year, we're opening up an elementary school next year, we've got an early childhood center. All that growth is a testament to the fact that people want to live there. They want to go there because of the University of Missouri, but also because of Stevens College and Columbia College, and it's just an amazing community. We have ACT scores that are higher than the state and national averages, AP scores better than the state and national averages. One of the things we're most excited about is that we worked with an organization called EOS, the Equal Opportunity School, to look at ways to get underrepresented kids into AP and honors coursework. Because we know if you take an AP course, you're more likely to finish college. And if you take 2 AP courses, you're 60% more likely to finish in 4 years. After that, there's no real difference. And so we realized that we had a participation gap. And so we started working with our principals and our counselors to really encourage kids to take it. And we had one teacher who said, I think we're watering down our AP program when you're putting kids into a class that they can't do. And at the end of the year, 98% of our kids still had a 3, 4, or 5 on the AP. And at that point, it was a game changer. It was game over. It was any kid, as long as we tell them they can do it and we support them along the way, they can. So I really feel like, as some of the themes that we saw tonight about poverty, it is also about an attitude shift for districts to say these kids can do it, and that we give them the more rigorous coursework. We've got an incredible preschool program. We have an incredible music and art program, athletics. All of those things make Columbia a pretty special place. And you're right, we don't toot our horns enough. That last scene with the superintendent driving, going, you know, in public education, we really talk more about, if we're here 25 minutes tonight and we talked 20 minutes about all the woes about funding and testing and poverty, I mean, really wish we could flip it because, you know, looking at ways to do dual enrollment, dual credit, so that kids can enter college a year ahead, you know, instead of entering and trying to figure out what they're going to do. So I'm glad that you asked the question. I hope I didn't prod you too hard to let us do it.
That's all right.
It was part of your plan.
Whatever you say, Mr. Facilitator.
That's right.
Well,
That's right. Superintendents, you watch out. Type-A personalities.
I told everybody, I'm like, I may not say anything the whole night. But I think one of the things that you know, we have also learned in the process for this, for us as an institution, is we can be of service to you in the sense of helping you get those messages out and trying to get some of those stories out, you know, about some things that are really happening. And I think you know, at the end of the documentary, the superintendent says something that I really admired, and he said, "What good does it do us to be the best school system in a state where we're, you know, 45th place?" And so you were talking a minute ago about expectations. I mean, how important in your assessment is expectation as a tool both to motivate staff and to motivate students?
Well, it's huge. When you're dealing with students particularly, you know, too often, especially with the high poverty levels, we tend to underestimate them, or we don't realize that if you address whatever it is that's holding them back, there's so much more potential there and so much farther that they can go. And I think that's the trick, is to figure out how do you meet that basic need, move them beyond that, and allow them to go much higher and expect for them to go much higher. Perfect example, you know, when I first came to the district I'm in, my oldest child, had experienced kindergarten at a different district, and he came out of kindergarten reading. Flip to a new district, they weren't doing those same activities till sometime into first grade. Different expectations. It's possible to do these other things at kindergarten. They had just never experienced it. So it takes someone with that vision and that leadership wanting to show them the possibilities. And then you have to kind of bring that staff along with you.
The real trick is to hire the best and the brightest teachers out there to help these kids. The unfortunate part is, as he said, we've sat here and talked 20 minutes about all the woes of education. That's not real encouraging to the young college student that says, oh, I might want to be a teacher someday. They need to hear those good things. They need to know the value that we place on them. And we're all very lucky here. I know that we all have great teachers, and they do the best they can for kids every day. And in turn, our kids will continue to improve.
Well, in the second half of the program coming up here in just a few minutes, we're actually going to talk to some teachers and some folks who are training teachers in Central Missouri. So we are going to follow up on that, Scott, I promise.
We'll talk about that. I'm sure if you don't get a chance to ask, and I'm sure one will mention, is that high stakes testing atmosphere is now hitting the universities, right? Where they're going to track the scores of the teachers and tie it back to their education program as a way to measure the effectiveness of a program. And so, I jokingly said, welcome to the club.
Yeah, we're tracking kids K through 12, and now that seems like it's going to start following them on beyond.
Yeah. The number one factor on a student's success, the influence on a student's success, is whether or not that child believes in himself. And you can't deny that a child believes in himself or herself because a teacher spent the time to tell you, I believe in you. And you see it in the documentary, right? I mean, they kick out Rashawn, and then who's going and meeting that kid on his prep period, right? But that teacher. And you hope to God that kid is going to find another person in middle school who's going to believe in him. Right. And just like you said, our community has said that the top three things that they most care about are high quality teachers, a nurturing environment for their kids, and smaller class sizes. And boy, that nurturing environment by a highly qualified teacher will make any kid do whatever you ask, and they will learn for you. They'll believe in you because you believe in them.
So when you think about that and sort of the expectation that you have for those teachers and those students in those classrooms, is this a money thing? Is this, when you talk about hiring the best and the brightest, in some ways all three of you guys are competitors, does it ultimately get down to money?
So we were talking at dinner tonight. I've been working with our CTA salary committee in our district, and they've done a little bit of research statewide. And over the last 25 years, Missouri teacher salaries have fallen from somewhere into the 30s down to we're like the 48th state as far as average teacher pay. And so if you also look then at the cost of college for those teachers coming into the profession, it's gone up something like 120%. I mean, it's just the pay is not keeping pace with the expense to get there, and so that is a concern, I think, for our best and brightest. If it's going to take them half their career to pay off their loan, that's a hard thing to want to do. So.
Well, and the Star recently did a very interesting article about problems in Kansas with teachers, leaving the state to go to bordering states because the situation there for them is not good.
Right. And that's one thing Missouri should be very proud of is in terms of its pension for teachers. Yeah. It is in good shape. It is a strong pension, and it's true. A lot of people will start coming over from other states because Illinois and Kansas, certainly with what they've done with their tax makeup and how they've done all those tax breaks. We're going to reap the benefit probably of getting some really good teachers because of that. Yeah.
The key is you've got to keep them at least 5 or 6 years.
Right.
If you lose them in those first 2 or 3 years, which is very typical, that's the highest amount of turnover happens in those first 2 or 3 years. You probably won't ever get them back. So if you keep them and you've got a competitive salary schedule, you've got good benefits. Missouri does have a great pension program. That's one thing that 24, 25-year-old students really don't think too much about is retirement, but it should be a factor in their decision making. So I think that is one thing we do have here in Missouri that's very strong.
We see that in our district since we're located down at the Lick of the Ozarks. So we get people who are retiring from Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas. It's not unusual for us to pick up a retiree and be able then to keep them till they're vested in our system, and it's because our retirement system is so attractive.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left in this segment of the program. I wanted to go around the room here and have you all, if you could allow folks that are watching tonight to know something about the current state of public education. What are the things that you think that are most critical for people to understand that maybe they don't really know or don't have any experience with? So I'll let that sink in for a minute, right? Okay. So you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So I like to speak of things in our district as three columns. So there's A, E, and O. Achievement, enrichment, and opportunity. And then I say access for all kids, right? It's an access to an excellent education. So what I would want viewers to know is that, in terms of achievement, this whole business with the House Bill 1490 and rewriting these standards, I really think is probably not a good use of time. The standards as they were written are good standards. There's not a standard that you can pick out and say, I'm really against kids adding, or I'm really against kids being able to look at two texts and be able to compare. And the argument like that they make in the documentary about that I don't want kids in South Carolina to have to be learning what kids in New Hampshire are learning. It's not that you're learning the same materials. There are no materials associated with the Common Core. What it is rather to say, okay, so in South Carolina, if we wanted to understand our history and how, what was Reconstruction like after the Civil War, they can do that and look at materials and look at first, primary documents and do that. Whereas New Hampshire might be looking at what does our moniker "live free and die" really mean, right? Okay. Enrichment, I think I said this in Columbia when we showed the documentary. I really feel strongly that our kids need to have more enrichment, more music, more art, more world languages, those types of things. So Columbia is going to be teaching Chinese starting next year. As a Mandarin Chinese, all 6th graders, all 1,300 of them, will start getting some Chinese exposure because I think it's important. And the last is opportunity. We have to figure out ways to eliminate those barriers that keep kids from accessing school. So more adaptable ways to say, if you bring a knife to school, you try to distribute drugs, you can't come to school, but we're going to figure out another way to get you that high school diploma because you are dead in the water if you don't have a high school diploma. And so, that's something that we have had to pick up, is how to figure out how to make sure that kid still has a chance, even if they can't access the mainstream.
I think the most important part is just that public schools have received a bad rap and continue. Everybody wants to downgrade public schools, public school education. We do a good job. We certainly have improvements that we constantly have to make. That's part of what we do. We learn all the time. We ask our kids to learn and grow and achieve. We've got to do the same thing in our schools, and I think we're doing a good job of that here in Missouri. So I think just getting that message out there is probably very important.
And I would say, to follow up on that, that it's putting the kids first, and that is what all the teachers that I know do. That is what all the administrators that I know do. It's meeting the needs of kids and putting children first, and that has always been our primary focus, and I think will always continue to be our primary focus in public education.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time, and the conversation will continue in just a couple of minutes. We're going to go inside the classroom and the future of the classroom as we talk about teacher education here in Central Missouri. Once again, I'd like to thank my panelists tonight, Dr. Peter Stiepleman from Columbia Public Schools, Dr. Scott Patrick from Warrensburg City Schools, and Dr. Joyce Ryerson from Versailles. Thank you so much. We'll be back with more in a minute.
It is our oldest enemy and perhaps our most feared. But what do we really know about cancer?
Make no mistake, this is one of the most significant human challenges in our history.
Now more than ever, there is reason for hope.
When you look at what's going on with cancer right now, it's stunning.
Cancer, the emperor of all maladies.
Immediately following Cancer, the Emperor of All Maladies, I'll be hosting a panel of medical experts to answer your questions regarding this insidious disease. We'll also showcase cancer patients' journeys from diagnosis to survivorship. I look forward to you joining the discussion for Cancer Following the Cure. Corporate support for cancer following the cure is provided by Boone Hospital Center and the Stewart Cancer Center.
Oh, hey, Natalie, what's going on?
Just checking out UMag on Twitter, hashtag awesome.
Oh, right. Hashtag KMOS, hashtag choose red, hashtag the source you trust.
Hey, gals, what are we hashtag talking about?
Hashtag UMag.
Hashtag duh.
Hashtag palm to forehead. Hashtag walk of shame.
To find the source you trust, follow us at UCM_UMag and tweet us sometime.
And welcome back to 180 Days Rewind. I'm your host, Dr. Phil Hoffman, General Manager here of KMOS. And we hope you're enjoying the conversation now about public education in Central Missouri. We're going to continue that conversation now, joined by two new guests. And our two new guests are Holly Bennett, who is a teacher in Kingsville schools, my hometown now, so go Kingsville. And we also have Dr. Joyce Downing, who is the Associate Dean of Special Education here at the University of Central Missouri. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having a teacher here.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear from the classroom teachers. So let's talk about the documentary from your perspective, Holly. You're in the classroom every day, and you see the kids. You have that direct contact every single day. Did things ring pretty true to you from the documentary and what you saw?
Yes, very much so. It I'm sure is a pretty typical scene from any classroom. Mine are smaller, but yeah, a very typical classroom scene in most of them.
And of course, you know, Dr. Downing, you're involved with training the next generation of educators here. Those students are going out and they're doing their student teaching assignments, I assume. And so you probably get daily reports of their experiences, or you hear about kind of what's going on. What's your sense of the documentary and issues it presents, and how true to reality today is that here in Central Missouri?
I think it's very true to reality now, but I also was struck by how similar it was to my experience teaching in the late 70s in the Kansas City, Missouri School District. I started out in urban education, and that's really kind of where my heart was. And so many of the issues of poverty and single parent, fragile families and transients are very similar to what I saw when I started out as a teacher, and part of what helped me decide to go into special education, because the kids like Rashawn were the kids that I wanted to take home with me or to figure out. One of the things that we do that is different now than was different in the 70s when I was trained is that when I went out to student teach, that was really my first real experience working with children in classrooms, and we now are using the clinical model, which is more like med school, where from the sophomore year on, students are in classrooms with children, sometimes observing and sometimes actually working with individuals and groups of children, so that they have an opportunity to try things out at different grade levels, to really see a range of districts and kinds of kids, and also to try their skills and make sure that this really is what they want to do, because teaching requires dedication and heart, and some of our students find out early in their program.
Right, not for me,
maybe
right?
It's not for them, but the vast majority of them come back convinced that it is what they want to do.
Well, and certainly the clinical model, I think, is good in the sense that maybe I think I want to teach little kids, but then when I actually do it for a while, I think, oh, yeah, maybe older students, right? So that could be a game changer also.
That's one of the best things in the teaching program is to have them in the classroom more often, because nothing really prepares you for your own classroom than stepping inside it. So I think the more we put our teacher students into real classrooms and let them feel more comfortable, the better their transition into their own classroom is going to be.
One of the things that the panelists in the first half of the show talked about was that sense of disconnect and distrust even in what's going on in schools. I'm wondering, Holly, from your experience, do you see that? I mean, the nice thing about Kingsville is a small school system, and you know, we were talking earlier, you know a lot of people that you maybe even grew up with.
Right.
So is there that same sense, do you think?
I kind of have the best of both worlds. We are very family oriented, and I have a strong connection with many of my parents. But the word transient came in, and there's a lot of transient families, and that is a much tougher relationship to build. I think in general our direction has just changed to it's not as easy to think that your child may have made a mistake, and so it takes time to build that up. Not necessarily for some of my old relationships, but some of the new ones, it takes a little time to convince them that always our best interest, or my concern is the best interest of the student.
Well, certainly. I mean, when we talk about this disconnect, you know, my experience with educators is like any other job. I mean, you might have one or two folks in any school system that are maybe not trying their hardest, but in general, my experience is that most people are trying much harder than they're given credit for as educators.
I think that's absolutely true. It's the best and hardest job I think that you could ever have. And one of the things that concerns me from the video as well as from my experiences in school districts recently is, and it goes along with the trust issue, and that's the one, I believe Pierre Brown in the show was the one who said, I didn't have anybody I could identify with in my school. There were no male teachers. There was nobody who looked like me, and I think a lot of our students still have that experience where they are in a school district where the majority of teachers and administrators don't look identifiable to them. They don't think the same way, they don't have the same backgrounds. And I was struck watching the administrators and the teachers in the video talking about their own experiences and how they could identify with the children, either because their parents were sharecroppers or because they had had behavioral problems of their own in school. And one of my concerns as a educator of future educators is that as we raise the stakes for getting into teacher ed programs and then getting out of them and getting certified, our reliance on standardized testing as sort of the be-all and end-all of transition is that I'm afraid we're going to be eliminating more and more of those underrepresented folks, because I don't know how many of those people had really high ACT scores or how many of them excelled at taking standardized tests under high-stress conditions. And I'm concerned that we're eliminating some of the people who have the dedication and the heart but aren't good test takers from our teacher candidate pool.
Well, Holly, as a teacher in the classroom, if there was something that you wish parents understood about what teachers do that maybe they don't, or they don't see it, what kind of things would you point out to folks?
Certainly that my care and concern is so genuine. I have a passion for my job. I want every child to succeed. I want every child to walk away having grown in not just what I've taught, but whatever area in my school district, you know, every area, I want them to be successful. And I'm very willing to do more and more and more than what maybe a 9-to-5 job requires. And we do that. Teachers do that every day. It's very rare for us to have an 8-hour day. And my own 2 sons hate that I'm a teacher because I work so much. But you know, it's the job with the greatest rewards and the greatest heartbreak if I can't help somebody. And so I want teachers to know that they can come to me and we need to partner together to get their child through this, through struggles, through difficulties, through tragic situations, whatever the case may be. They can go to a classroom teacher and ally with them to help their child progress and grow.
And I think, you know, for me, this is the perfect moment to wrap up the show on, in the sense that a kid, as they mentioned in the documentary, is not a data point, nor is a teacher.
Right.
You know, you can't assess somebody's impact on a student's life by giving them a standardized test or letting them check a list. And so I think in our quantifiable universe that we live in the United States now, there's sort of a dismissive attitude about like, oh, well, teachers make a difference. Well, that's a trite saying. Prove it.
Well, I would welcome anybody to come into my school district and hear my kids. You see Miss Mann hugging all the kids. I'll see you next year. I'll see you next year. I teach high school, and I'll have seniors come up or juniors come up and say, you're going to be here next year when I get back, right? You're going to be here when I graduate, right? We are, the school district and the teachers are a rock to our students. We are a constant, especially in a small district where things don't change, faces don't change very often, and we are a secure point for each child. And you know, I'm proud of that. I'm happy to be that person for our students.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today. We're almost out of time. I will say again, we're lucky in Central Missouri to have educators and people training our future educators like you, and we're lucky to have the folks who have been with us earlier in the program to talk about the challenges and the struggles facing public education here in Central Missouri. And more importantly, I think the most important thing I got out of this is it's not all bad news. There's definitely some good news. We're going to do our part to try to bring that good news to you here at KMOS. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Dr. Phil Hoffman, and we'll see you soon.